Welcome to Scripture Insights. I'm Taylor Halverson.
Everybody, thanks for listening. I'm Mike Harris.
Today we'll be discussing Alma chapter 53 through 63. And as an overview highlight, we're looking at the outcomes to covenantal faithfulness or disloyalty to God. What happens when people are loyal and faithful to God or not? And one of the great examples, what we'll be seeing, is these stripling warriors who show faithfulness and devotion because they have been taught by their mothers to be loyal to God and to trust that God will deliver. And I'll just point out right now, these mothers are total heroes, and many of them probably had raised their children as single moms. Because remember, the anti-Nephi Lehis lost 1,000 people when the Lamanites started slaughtering them, and it may have been many of the men who'd gone out to just be out there to kind of defend the families. So you may have lost a lot of men. So these boys may have grown up in single mom homes.
And it wasn't because their dads were slackers.
No,
they had been willing to die for the cause.
They had been willing to die for the cause. So we'll jump right here into chapter 53, and the people of Ammon, they see the danger that the Nephites are under, and they want to break their covenant and go to battle. And it turns out Helaman, verse 15, feared that they would lose their souls if they broke the covenant. Verse 16, but behold, came to pass, they had many sons who had not entered into a covenant, that they should not take their weapons of war to defend themselves. Why? Because they were really young when that covenant was made. And so as many as were able to take up arms, they called themselves Nephites. And they entered into a covenant to fight for the liberty. They were willing to lay down their lives. And notice here, verse 18, and there were 2,000 of those young men of God, Alma. And Helaman becomes their leader, verse 19. And it says again, they were all young men. Again, my brain starts thinking, yeah, that's Alma. They're exceedingly valiant for courage, verse 21. They are men of truth and soberness.
They walk uprightly before God.
Yes, that covenantal phrase.
Last episode you mentioned that. We keep seeing that. That suggested what again?
It's a covenantal phrase. It's a technical term referring to that somebody's on the covenant path and they are seeking to be loyal to God.
In the Old Testament, the presence of God was considered, correct me if I'm wrong, in the tabernacle of Moses, in the Holy of Holies, or in the Holy of Holies in the Solomon's temple, wasn't it? And so that was considered God's throne room. And so if you're walking uprightly before God, you're participating in this temple worship. Is that?
That's exactly right. In fact, the phrase to walk before God, as you know, in Hebrew, the word before is lifnei, which means to the face of. You're face to face.
In his presence.
That's exactly right. So you're having his presence to be with you. So it's all tied together. It's like at sacrament, I promise to remember Jesus and to try to walk the covenant path, and in return, I have God's presence with me. So I'm walking before God. So just to make things really not complex, all of us can be walking uprightly before God, go to church every week, sincerely partake of the sacrament, don't do it with empty purpose. In fact, the word to take the Lord's name in vain or with empty purpose would be, I make a covenant but have no intention of keeping it. That's taking the Lord's name in vain. But we can also be walking uprightly before God by taking the sacrament and purposely and intentionally trying to remember Jesus at all times. It's pretty straightforward. Notice how they are called these 2,000 stripling soldiers in verse 22. And that the Hebrew word for stripling is elam. Sounds like Alam or Alma. So you have Elam and Alma. You got this wordplay going on. Mm-hmm. So they keep kind of highlighting that these young men have grown up and been taught by their mothers to be faithful. Chapter 54, you have this negotiation of prisoners, and Ammoron, this dissident Nephite, is now writing this letter to Moroni and vice versa, and they're trying to convince one another to give up the battle. And it's just interesting how the diplomacy was being conducted. And it turns out neither side was really willing to listen to the narrative of the other side. And that's why the war continued. And appropriately for Moroni, he's not about to give in to the conditions or the false narrative that Ammoron was imposing upon the Lamanites and then by extension the Nephites through this battle. And I just summarize right down here, verse 23 and 24. I am Amram, a descendant of Zoram, he who is self-exalted, or the exalted one. That's what Amram was trying to do, is exalt himself. And behold, now I am a bold Lamanite. I'm a bold unbeliever. And he was.
Should we talk about the word religion in verse 10?
Yeah, that's a good one about maintaining the religion and cause of our God.
So Taylor, should we talk real quick about the word religion here in verse 10?
Yeah, where they talk about the Nephites and the sons of the people of Ammon are going forth to maintain our religion and the cause of our God.
In the October 2023 General Conference, Elder Alan T. Phillips talked about the word religion. He says religion is not only about our relationship with God, it is also about our relationship with each other. And then he quotes Elder Jeffrey R. Holland saying that this word religion comes from the Latin religare, meaning to tie, or more literally, to retie. Thus, true religion is the tie that binds us to God and to each other. And you see this word religion in the war chapters occurring 10 times.
Which is interesting. The whole point of scriptures is to talk about how we are tied to God, tied to one another, about religion. And the word religion does not show up a lot in scripture. And yet, here it is in the war chapters, concentrated, because these people, the righteous people, are tying themselves one another in covenant, binding themselves to defend the ability to be tied to God. Whereas the apostates and the Lamanites are trying to cut all those ties, figuratively and physically.
Chapter 55. Moroni is not happy with the offer.
Moroni arms everybody in the city, all the Nephites who've been in prison, men, women, and children, anybody who can bear arms. And the Lamanites, when they wake up, they realize there's an army of people inside the prison city, and there's an army outside, and they basically gave themselves up. And verse 23, they cast their weapons at the feet of the Nephites, pleading for mercy. And what did Moroni do? He took the prisoners of war, took possession of the city, and caused that all the prisoners should be liberated. This is what Jesus does. He liberates us. And he then had the Lamanites start building his fortifications to make the city even better defensible. Now notice that the Lamanites also tried stratagem, and notice how Mormon describes how the Nephites protected themselves against stratagem. Verse 31, behold, the Nephites were not slow to remember the Lord. Now, sure, they were building embankments around the cities and pickets, and they were probably building weapons and training, but notice, this is critically important. They were not slow to remember the Lord. So God expects us to work hard, but at the same time, remember the Lord. Now, what are some ways we can remember the Lord? How about go to sacrament meeting?
And then the opposite of being slow to remember would be to remember comes from the Hebrew word, we've mentioned this before, zakar, which can mean either to mention or to remember. So again, it's not just a cognitive exercise, a mental process. So I'm going to remember God's goodness, but we want to speak about Jesus Christ. We want to talk about him in natural, normal, and happy ways.
So we can take heart that hopefully we're not all in war circumstances like the Nephites, but the foundation for all preparation is to not be slow to remember the Lord. And then in verse 32, it says the Nephites did try all their liquors, meaning they had tested with Lamanite before they tried themselves. And I kind of think about the concept of just, we should run tests or experiments on things where we don't know stuff. This is actually something we teach at the university. Like if you don't know something, run a test or experiment, design it well so that it's going to give you good data. And this is what Alma teaches, like nourish that seed. And acting in faith is not to be blind. It's to be trusting certain things some things you know, and you are running tests to gain further light and knowledge. And that's one of the takeaways I see from these verses. Well, then we get into chapter 56, and the story now begins to tell us more about Helaman's experience with the Stripling warriors. And this is about the year 30. And as you mark your scriptures, you might even mark the years of the reign of the judges so you can keep yourself kind of oriented about what time period it is. So Helaman is now telling the story of how he, with the Stripling warriors, supported the Nephite armies. And of course, they didn't have a large group, and even Antipas that they went to go support also had not received sufficient support from the Nephite nation. And so look at verse 16. They were depressed, this is the men of Antipas, in body as well as in spirit, for they had fought valiantly by day and toiled by night to maintain their cities, and thus they had suffered great afflictions of every kind. And now they were determined to conquer in this place or die. Therefore, you may well suppose, this is Helaman speaking to Captain Moroni in an epistle, that this little force which I brought with me, yea, those sons of mine, gave them great hopes and much joy. And it turns out that the Lamanites, Helaman was worried they might attack, but because there was now more force, the Lamanites didn't attack. And Helaman says in verse 19, we were favored of the Lord because had the Lamanites started attacking right then, they may not have been able to survive. So Antipas hatches a stratagem to lure out the Lamanites in a way that they could then take the city that the Lamanites had conquered. And so he sent Helaman with his Stripling warriors to march past the city and then march off in the wilderness as if they were going to take supplies somewhere. And the Lamanites get tricked into, oh, we're going to go chase these guys down and kill them. And so a long march ensues for Helaman to get away from the Lamanites. Antipas is then fleeing, or he is pursuing the Lamanites, and it's kind of a fast march. And eventually, the Lamanites pause and turn. Helaman and his Stripling warriors aren't sure what happens, and he asks these young men, what do you want to do? And I love what he says here, beginning in verse 45, all the way down to verse 48. These are verses that are well worth our time reading. Verse 44, my sons, will you go against them to battle? And now I say unto you, my beloved brother Moroni, that never have I had I seen so great courage, nay, not amongst all the Nephites. For as I had ever called them my sons, for they were all very young, even so they said unto me, Father, behold, our God is with us, and he will not suffer that we should fall. Then let us go forth. We would not slay our brethren if they would let us alone. Therefore let us go, lest they should overpower the army of Antipas. And they never had fought, yet they did not fear death, and they did think more upon the liberty of their fathers than they did upon their lives. Yea, they had been taught by their mothers that if they did not doubt, God would deliver them. And they rehearsed unto me the words of their mothers, saying, we do not doubt, our mothers knew it. Not that their mothers believed it, but their mothers knew it. And notice how back in verse 46, they say, we would not slay our brethren. They don't call them enemies. They recognize that the war they're having is with other fellow humans, and that these are also children of God, but they also have a duty and obligation, now being part of the Nephite nation, to protect the Nephites. And of course, they come into the battle. Antipas had already fallen by the sword, and Helaman and his young men turn the tide of battle and stop the Lamanites and end up creating this victory. They surround the Lamanites and they slay them insomuch, verse 54, the Lamanites were compelled to deliver up their weapons of war and also themselves as prisoners. And in verse 56, but behold, to my great joy, there had not one soul of these Stripling warriors fallen to the earth. Yea, they had fought as with the strength of God. Yea, never were men known to have fought with such miraculous strength and with such mighty power. It's a really miraculous, powerful story. And again, it's a testament of God's enduring grace and power upon all of us. When we are covenantally loyal and faithful, we have greater measure of God's power to protect us from the difficulties and the armies and battles that we face every day in our lives. So Helaman continues to talk about the exploits and successes that his young men had in defending the Nephites and also taking over territory that the Lamanites had taken from the Nephites. And again, they have another battle that breaks out with the Lamanites, and I love the way that Helaman explains and describes these young men. He says in verse 21, Yea, and they did obey and observe to perform every word of command with exactness. Yea, and even according to their faith it was done unto them. And I did remember the words which they had said unto me, that their mothers had taught them. And of course they succeeded. But what's fascinating is in our lives today, hopefully none of us are having to go out to battle, but every day there is a spiritual challenge. We are battling the forces that would draw us away from God. If we also obey and observe to perform every word of command with exactness, we can be like these young men. None of them died, even though all of them wounded, some of them even fainted. And I know in my life I've sometimes felt to faint from the burdens I was carrying, but God empowers us. In fact, listen to what it says here in verse 26. We ascribe it to the miraculous power of God because of their exceeding faith, in which they had been taught to believe. I'm going to tie this back into 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 20, where Nephi says, one of his thesis statements is, I will show unto you the tender mercies of the Lord are over all those whom he hath chosen because of their faith to make them mighty even unto the power of deliverance.
There it is.
That is a consistent theme throughout the Book of Mormon. God delivers the faithful.
I have a colleague who was in attendance at the Missionary Training Center in Provo when President Nelson visited, and he quoted this verse, verse 25, and he compared the missionaries there to the Stripling warriors. It says, all of you are wounded because of pornography. But like the Stripling warriors, not one of us need to be lost because of our faith in Jesus Christ. I think that's a powerful modern day application. We're all going to receive wounds, spiritual wounds, but none of us need to perish because of our faith in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I like how Helaman concludes this chapter, end of verse 35 and part of 36, he says, for behold, it is God that has delivered us, yea, that has done this great thing for us. And I was filled with exceeding joy because of the goodness of God in preserving us. That's the middle of verse 36 of Alma chapter 57. So 58, their circumstances don't fully improve because they're not getting the material and moral support from the heartland, from Zarahemla, that's required. And they were just really discouraged and weighed down because they didn't get more support from the government. And they didn't know what was going on. They thought maybe we're not faithful enough. Verse 10 says, we did pour out our souls in prayer to God that he would strengthen us and deliver us out of the hands of our enemies. Verse 11, came to pass that the Lord our God did visit us with assurances that he would deliver us, yea, insomuch that he did speak peace to our souls and did grant unto us great faith and did cause us that we should hope for our deliverance in him.
Hope in the gospel context, or as it's used in scriptures, suggests, well, if we use it in our vernacular, hope suggests that I'm not sure if it's going to happen, but I hope. But as used in the gospel and in the scriptures, hope, you know it's going to happen. You have a surety. You might not know how it's going to work out, but you know it will.
And we see that actually happening as this chapter progresses, that they use stratagem yet again to try to overpower the Lamanites. And again, these young men are the decoy, and the Nephite armies then have to kind of work to surround the Lamanites. And it turns out that they were able to take an entire city, which had been a very stronghold from the Lamanites, because they were able to use this decoy to trick the Lamanites to leave the city. And it caused the Lamanites to flee from the land, because when the Lamanites realized that the Nephites were heading towards Zarahemla, the ones that were the decoy, the Lamanites got afraid that there might be a trap. Sure enough, it was. They head back to the city, find out, oh my gosh, the Nephites are in here. So they flee the land, but they also capture a bunch of people along the way. And Helaman concludes with these things. Verse 37, we trust God will deliver us. In fact, he just has told a story of how God had delivered them, and that he will continue to deliver us from our enemies. Verse 37. And he goes on in verse 39. Not one soul has been slain among these young stripling warriors, which again is evidence God delivers the faithful. He goes on, they have received many wounds, similar to what you were talking about with Elder President Nelson. Nevertheless, they stand fast or strong in that liberty wherewith God has made them free. And they are strict to remember the Lord their God from day to day, yea, to observe to keep his statutes and his commandments, his judgments and his commandments continually. And their faith is strong in the prophecies concerning that which is to come.
That's a great phrase to, if somebody's looking for a good idea for your gospel doctrine class, remember the Lord their God from day to day.
Mm-hmm.
That could create a great discussion. What do we do on a daily basis to remember the Lord?
Yeah. And what's interesting about you bringing that up is that this, again, seems to be the fundamental strategy that the stripling warriors used to be prepared. Now, they did a lot of other things. It is not enough just to sit around and pray. If I pray that I can make enough money to feed my family, if I'm in dire circumstances and I lost my job, I think God can do things to deliver me. But if I reject the means of deliverance he's provided, like go get an education and go apply for jobs and work with your network and get up every day to go do your job and don't lose it, things like that. If I reject the means of deliverance and then I can't feed my family, I can't really say, oh, God did not deliver me. But if we are faithful, fundamentally by every day choosing to believe in God and then getting up and acting and working, we're far more likely to see God's hand in our lives and a positive outcome. So Moroni gets this epistle, and he's just thrilled to hear of the successes and the joy of the outcome of these young men who have done so much to preserve the Nephites. So despite the joy that Moroni has in the success of Helaman and the Nephites and the young stripling warriors, unfortunately there's ongoing contention back in the government. Which, by the way, if we're always at each other's throat, it's really difficult to build enduring, successful societies. And we see that outcome again here, that verse 5, Moroni is making preparations to go against the Lamanites. What happens? Amaron has come against the city of Nephi-ha, a very powerful city, and overtakes it and slaughters many Nephites. And it says, with an exceedingly great slaughter. Really super sad. So, verse 11, when Moroni saw that the city Nephi-ha was lost, he was exceedingly sorrowful and began to doubt. Why? Because of the wickedness of the people. In verse 12, the chief captains, they doubted and marveled also because of the wickedness of the people, and this because of the success of the Lamanites over them. And it came to pass that Moroni was angry with the government because of their indifference concerning the freedom of their country. So he writes a really angry letter. And of course, just as a preview, Pahoran, who's the chief judge, had been kicked out of power by kingmen and others who did not want to preserve the liberty. And Pahoran gets this really angry letter from Moroni and writes back with magnanimity and kindness and forgiveness, and is not angry at Moroni for basically calling him out. Now, there's a couple of things to point out in this letter from Moroni that might be relevant to us today. I'm going to share some verses and we'll talk about what might this mean for us. Moroni says things like, in verse 5, great has been your neglect towards us. Verse 6, exceedingly great neglect, your thoughtless state. Verse 7, can you think to sit upon your thrones in a state of thoughtless stupor? Yea, verse 8, even they who have looked up to you for protection, yea, even placed you in a situation that ye might have succored them, yea, ye might have sent armies unto them to strengthen them and have saved thousands of them from falling by the sword. But ye, in verse 9, have withheld your provisions from them. And he ends that verse, your exceedingly great neglect towards them. Verse 11, behold, could you suppose that you could sit upon your thrones, and because of the exceeding goodness of God, you could do nothing and he would deliver you? So when I read these verses, I think, what am I doing in my life? Where have I been put in a position where I can use my time, talents, and resources to provide succor, support, and help to those in need? Or do I just sit back and say, wow, look at all the things God's given me. I am so blessed of God. Man, people who don't have what I have, clearly must be wicked people. It would be nice if God did something to fix that, but man, I'm so grateful I could just sit back. And it makes me think like I should not be lulled into carnal security by thinking, oh, well, it was just those bad Nephite leaders. That even in my own circumstances, have I been given learning, education, material resources, loving encouragement that I could be sharing with others in their moment of need instead of being stuck in my own thoughtless state of stupor.
You're the hymn, because I've been given much, I too must give. Really, a lot of us we've been blessed to live like kings.
Yeah.
In comparison to a lot of our good brothers and sisters throughout the world. And I love your sentiment there. We need to make sure that we're paying an honest tithe, fasting once a month, giving a generous fast offering, and the Lord will multiply that to bless a lot of people that are hurting.
And I don't know about you, but I've had many, many moments in my life where I wish I had more means to do more. And sometimes even felt like, well, maybe my little tiny gift offering is not of any value. And particularly in that latter thought, no matter who you are, God has given you something that will benefit other people. It just might be a kind word, a smile, a hug. Those are all things that are actually meaningful for individuals, don't usually cost a lot, and any one of us can give, but we all have a way of uplifting, supporting, and succoring those around us. And if we do have more, we should consider, how could I share more freely so that others can also benefit as God has freely shared with me? It's not a new message. We've been hearing this throughout the Book of Mormon.
One other message that I find fascinating that's woven throughout these war chapters is it's fascinating who's to blame for the wars, the deaths, and all these destructions. You would expect it to say, oh, those wicked, bloodthirsty Lamanites. But multiple times there are verses that tell us something different. For instance, look here in chapter 60, verse 16. You see the phrase 3 times, among ourselves. Verse 16, yea, had it not been for the war which broke out among ourselves, yea, were it not for these kingmen who caused so much bloodshed among ourselves, yet at the time we were contending among ourselves. Sorry, I said 3 times, it's going to be 4 times. And then you go to the bottom, there, which was the cause of so much bloodshed among ourselves. And then if you go back to chapter 50, verse 21, it has been the Nephites, quarrelings, contentions, murderings, and the Nephites plundering, idolatry, whoredoms, their abominations, which were among themselves, here it is, which brought upon them their wars and destructions. In the same sentiment, it's the inner conflict amongst the Nephites that caused this destruction amongst them. It's easy to play the blame game and say, oh, those Lamanites. But the Book of Mormon continually emphasizes, you know what, the Lord would have blessed you all along and kept you safe and given you joy and happiness in whatever circumstance if you would have just kept the commandments. And you see that, I won't read them, but if you want to look at chapter 51, verse 16, and then also chapter 53, verse 9, it teaches that same principle.
What's so interesting is over the years, we always think the Lamanites are the bad guys. And usually they're the instrument of wicked Nephite anger. The Lamanites are often being manipulated by, well, for example, by these Nephites. He says back here in Alma 60, verse 17, because of the great wickedness of those who are seeking for power and authority, yea, even those kingmen. And unfortunately, those kinds of people still exist in our society today. And
it can happen in our own homes and friendships.
Right.
And in employment.
Right. Right.
Doctrine and Covenant, section 121, we've learned from sad experience, any time somebody gets a little bit of power or authority, they tend to misuse that.
Unrighteous dominion.
Yeah.
So it gets back to the basics. Love God, love your neighbor. And there were Nephites who were not practicing either. And it just led to all this terrible outcomes. Let's conclude here in verse 36 for this chapter. Behold, I am Moroni, your chief captain. I seek not for power, but to pull it down. I seek not for honor of the world, but for the glory of my God and the freedom and welfare of my country.
You got to love in chapter 61 Pahorn's humble, meek response to Moroni's scathing rebuke. He just wants to, he's not offended. He's just rejoicing in Moroni's goodness. Boy, there's a lesson there if we want to find more peace, not only in our communities, but in our relationships, in our homes, in our marriages, to have this kind of response and not get offended.
Yeah, he says, I am not angry. This is verse 9, but do rejoice in the greatness of your heart. And he says something similar to what Moroni had just said in the end of chapter 60. He says, I, Pahorn, do not seek for power, save only to retain my judgment seat, that I may preserve the rights and liberty of my people. My soul standeth fast or strong in that liberty in which God hath made us free. And at the beginning of the chapter, he laid out that it was these kingmen, people who, verse 4, they had great iniquity, great flattery. They led away the hearts of many people, and they daunted our freemen, and they were unwilling to protect the freedom. And do we ever see that anywhere in society today, where there are people who are unwilling to stand for freedom, but rather they want to promote more contention because they think they'll benefit from the chaos? So I love how Pahorn uses this interesting phrase down in verse 15. The Spirit of God, which is also the Spirit of freedom. And he uses this in the context as, Moroni, you need to come help me. We need to put down these insurrectionists, because insurrection is basically where you want to change the government through violent means or disordered means that are not lawful or legal. So these Nephites were essentially trying to overthrow the government, trying to practice insurrection. So Pahorn says, Moroni, come to me, let's join our people together, and let's go against these insurrectionists and pull down their pride, their power and authority. They'd already done it with the kingmen once before, have to do it again. And once we've cleansed the inner vessel, then we'll be strong enough to go stand against the Lamanites. And that sets up chapter 62. And that's exactly what happens. So, chapter 62, verse 4, Moroni leaves behind, in verse 3, Lehi and Teancum to kind of manage the affairs against the Lamanites, while he, in verse 4, raises the standard of liberty and gathers all these men, and he joins together with Pahorn, and they have this battle against this man named Pachus in verse 8, where they slay this insurrectionist, this guy who is trying to overthrow the Nephite power. And verse 9, the men of Pachus received their trial according to the law, and all those kingmen who had been taken and cast into prison, and they were executed according to the law. Well, notice it wasn't willy-nilly. They had a process in place. There was a system in place. These kingmen had refused to protect the land. They were traitors, and according to their law, traitors would be executed.
Today that would be sedition, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And it's interesting, in the United States, every now and then you do get sedition cases. There's been a few more recently, unfortunately. But the last time there was mass sedition cases was at the end of the Civil War. And when the United States, the northern states, won the war, they decided to forgive the southern states. And all these people who basically practiced sedition, it's like what the Nephites did to the Lamanites. Like, if you create a covenant of peace, we'll let you go off in peace. Or the northern states said, let's maintain this single country and we will forgive you. And that, unfortunately, is not what the kingmen got, because the kingmen were unwilling to defend the rights of freedom. They wanted to live in sedition. Well, sedition is like cancer. It either kills you or you get rid of it. And the Nephites decided, we're going to get rid of it. So, and it turns out it says, whoever was found in verse 10, denying their freedom, was speedily executed according to the law. And verse 11, they inflicted death upon all those who were not true to the cause of freedom, because it's pretty serious circumstances to stand against freedom. So at this point now, the Nephites are now finally at full strength. They go back out towards where Lehi and Teancum had been, and they continue to have these battles, and it gets to a point where all the Lamanites are concentrated in one single spot. And Teancum, once again, down here in verse 34, and following, verse 35, he's exceedingly angry with Amron. He believes that because of Amron and Malachiah, that they've been the cause of the great war. So Teancum, like he'd done prior, he decides, I'm going to end the life of Amron. I'm going to assassinate him, which he does, but unfortunately, Amron wakes up before he dies, and the servants of Amron pursue Teancum and kill him, verse 36. And I just feel for Moroni. We see Lehi and Moroni. We see their reaction in verse 37. When they knew that Teancum was dead, they were exceedingly sorrowful, for behold, he had been a man who had fought valiantly for his country, yea, a true friend to liberty, and he had suffered very many exceeding sore afflictions. But behold, he was dead and gone the way of all the earth. Now, by the way, somebody pointed this out to me at one point. Lehi, this general in the army, had been an army officer and a general many years before. He's mentioned earlier in the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Alma. And Moroni gets called as the chief captain at age 25. And here's Lehi, who continues to serve under Moroni and later will also serve under Moroni-ha. And you just see the loyalty of a man like Lehi or even Teancum, that even though they had been serving for a long time, Lehi got passed over to be the chief military officer after Moroni retires.
I had never thought about that.
Yeah, we're going to see that in Helaman. It's not mentioned explicitly, but it's just one of the outcomes that Lehi is so fixated on being loyal to the cause of justice and righteousness for the Nephites that he's willing to continue to fight on behalf of the Nephites, even though he's overlooked for what likely would have been a promotion that he deserved.
Do you have any thoughts on verse 36, where it talks about Teancum, he went forth, and then you got that prepositional phrase, in his anger. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't doubt Teancum's gone to heaven.
Yeah.
Amazing. He's our hero. But is there a lesson to be learned there, that even the most righteous of us, even if we're striving, we're on the covenant path, if we're not careful, maybe the anger could get the best of us?
We do know that Captain Moroni mentions a lot that he gets angry about things, but yeah, he has gone forth as an anger, and perhaps had Teancum not been angry, been a little more thoughtful, maybe he would have brought somebody else along with him to help defend him, or whatever it might be. But I think what you're getting at is anger does not typically serve to solve problems. I think in my own life, I'm trying to think of a time when me getting angry actually more quickly and positively solved a problem that I was dealing with. I can't think of one. Next episode, if I had thought of one in the meantime, I'll let you guys know, but I'm going to make a prediction right now. I will have nothing to say about that I won't have any example. So the story continues here that the next day, Moroni, verse 38, marches forth, comes upon the Lamanites, and they did slay them with a great slaughter, and they did drive them out of the land, and the Lamanites did flee, even though they did not return at that time against the Nephites. And verse 39, and thus they had wars and bloodshed and famine and affliction for the space of many years, and even there have been murders and so forth. But notice what Mormon says. Nevertheless, for the righteous sake, yea, because of the prayers of the righteous, the Nephites were spared. I'd add to this that when the Nephites stopped contending with one another internally and chose to be unified, the prayers of the righteous combined with that kind of positive unification allowed them to kick their enemies out of the land. But it's just kind of sad because verse 41 says, because of the length of the war, some people had hard hearts, others had turned to humility. Have you ever seen in your life two people suffering basically the same difficulty, and one person turns away from God and one person turns closer to God? It's interesting how it is our choice what we choose to do with the circumstances we find ourselves in. Our circumstances should not require one or the other. It is a choice. Suffering shouldn't necessarily require turning from God or humility, although it can compel us. And that's one of the things that Mormon is describing here, is that we should learn from the Nephites, that just like they got themselves stuck in circumstances, not of their own choosing, in part, they could choose their reaction to it. Now, Moroni, verse 43, he gives up the command to his son Moroni, and Helaman returns to preaching, but Horon returns to the judgment seat. And I'm going to jump ahead just to chapter 63 and look at verse 3. It came to pass that Moroni died also. And I've done the math on this, other people have as well. He was only 43 years old. So you imagine just the difficulties he must have been living under to have died at what seems like kind of a young age. But before we get back into 63, I want to just point out a couple of things as Helaman and his brothers and members of the church are now trying to reorder the church after all this war. It says, verse 48, the people of Nephi began to prosper again in the land. Verse 49, but they were not lifted up in the pride of their hearts, but they did humble themselves exceedingly before God. Verse 50, they did remember how great things the Lord had done for them, that he had delivered them from death and from bonds and from prison and from all manner of afflictions, and he had delivered them out of the hands of their enemies. And one of the key expectations of covenantal relationship with God is to remember how great things the Lord has done. From the Abrahamic promise perspective, God does great deeds. From the Mosaic promise perspective, from the Mosaic covenant perspective, it is our job to remember the great deeds of God. So we stay in a state of humility and stay aligned to him. And it's just interesting, these covenantal phrases that continue to be peppered throughout the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is the greatest covenantal text I've ever encountered anywhere.
One thing to maybe look for or to consider here in these war chapters is I can't help but wonder how Captain Moroni and the Stripling warriors, seeing that much violence, how do they deal with PTSD? Now, I don't know the first thing about PTSD. As I sit here in the comforts of the studio, and I have a very cush job, but there are a lot of people in the world that are exposed to violence, and we have the first responders that have to deal with a lot of violence. And it might be helpful to use these war chapters to see what they did to be able to, and I don't doubt there's times where you need professional help.
Yeah.
But at the same time, look for clues on what they did to deal with that, because we know that a lot of people that are struggling with PTSD, it hurts relationships, hurts marriages, and yet we have these beautiful examples of somehow Captain Moroni and the Stripling warriors and others, they were able to stay faithful under extremely difficult circumstances.
Yeah. You know, still it was really hard. We talked about that Captain Moroni himself died at age 43. At the end of chapter 62, Helaman has passed away. And he may only be about 40 years of age. And then later his brother Shiblon, who got the records, he passes away around possibly about the age of 42. So it may be that this amount of warfare, which probably also induced some famine, but just the stress of toil and whatever it might be, led to the early deaths of some of these leaders. Because it's interesting, as you get farther in the Book of Mormon, people are living for like 100 years. Like after Jesus shows up, some of the Book of Mormon record keepers are like living for 100 years or more. And that seems to be an outcome of when you live in a state of peace and prosperity, you have better and longer lived lives. Versus these very righteous leaders who lived in very deeply stressful circumstances.
That's an interesting insight.
And notice that even Corianton, he was not able to get the records because he had gone forth on a ship. It turns out Mormon takes the time to talk about after the war ends, it's like prosperity comes back and there's all this trade. Think about the end of, say, World War II. It took a while to kind of rebuild Europe and Japan and other places that had been devastated. But then there was this flourishing of economic output for decades. In fact, really, if we look since World War II, the world has had more and better economic outcomes than ever in human history. Now, we all still at times suffer and struggle, and there's unevenness in how those economic benefits have been spread around the world. But when you're not at war, when you can actually just be industrious and work together, great things can happen. And so they started building all these ships and heading north. And it's interesting, there's this guy named Hagoth, verse 5. He being exceedingly curious, he went forth and built him an exceedingly large ship on the borders of the land of Bountiful by the land of desolation, and he launched it forth. And then that ship came back, they built some other ships, and they went forth. Corianton went out, and then they lost track of and never heard from these people again. Now, by the way, just out of the Gee Whiz file, the word Hagoth or Hajoth might come from the Semitic word for Hajj. And if you're familiar with Islam, the pilgrimage that people do to Mecca is called the Hajj. And Hajj in Semitic languages, which is it's spelled like H-A-G or H-A-J, means to go forth on a journey. So it's interesting that the man who creates the means for people to go forth on a journey has the name that means to sally forth, perhaps on a pilgrimage.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, it's amazing that Joseph Smith, this 19th century farm kid from upstate New York, like when people say that he wrote the Book of Mormon, I say, no, it's a marvelous work and a wonder. It's an ancient, authentic witness of Jesus Christ. And the only reasonable explanation for the Book of Mormon is what it claims for itself, that it came forth by the gift and power of God through the prophet Joseph Smith as an ancient, authentic witness of Jesus Christ. Joseph Smith could have never known this stuff to do this. Just impossible.
Amen.
So as we conclude these war chapters, we hope that all of us, instead of focusing on the negative side and just the difficulty of war, would instead feel uplifted and to see the outcomes of deliverance for those who are faithful. And this is an ongoing, consistent theme that God, in the Book of Mormon, that God's mercy is available today, now for you. That whatever you're suffering from, He can provide deliverance daily, weekly, and throughout your life. And if you trust God, you can find that to be true. And we leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.